Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of this new initiative, which I'm calling Just Sales, where we will be talking to experts in sales and other connected fields on different topics pertaining to sales, sales management, and that is meant for a broader audience. I'm the host, Deva Rangarajan, and I am a professor of sales at IESEG School of Management in France, in Paris to be particular. Today, I have the privilege of having three wonderful writers, academics. I have Professor Rebecca Dingus, I have Professor Holton Wilson, and Professor Jeffrey Hoyle from Central Michigan University, all the way across the pond. So thank you all for being here, for chatting with me and our audience as well.
Good to be here.
Absolutely. Now, today we are going to be talking about an article of yours that I came across, which I think is very, very relevant given what is happening in the world right now. One is, of course, it's about forecasting. And the second thing is about this idea of the perceptions of women and how their forecasts matter as well. So essentially, I want to talk to you about that paper, which I would like to begin by asking, I guess, Horton, how did you get involved in this research on forecasting, and especially the role of women in it as well?
Well, it really started with my long-term interest in forecasting, but some work that I had been doing on who does forecasting in different industries. I'd done a couple papers related to marketing faculty and their perceptions of sales forecasting, and professional forecasters and their images of who should be doing forecasting and what techniques are used and so forth. And then we have this wonderful sales group here at Central Michigan University, faculty that are just exceptional. And I see Becca and Jeff just about every day. And sometime throughout the idea that maybe we could do something related to the process of forecasting within sales.
Building on that, I'm sure that if anybody who's turned on the news today have been talking about supply chain woes right now going around the world. People are talking about how, hey, if you want to plan for Christmas, you might want to order stuff now. And of course, since we're in France, we hear a lot about what's happening about supply chain woes in Britain and everything else in the UK as well. So from that viewpoint, how does forecasting fit into all these kind of current issues that we're having right now? I'm sure that when you did the research, you were not talking about current what's happening now, but you can easily kind of extrapolate your findings into what's happening in the world situation right now.
It's really interesting that the Institute for Business Forecasting, IBF, does some podcasts and interviews sort of similar, I guess. And over the last year, it's been COVID, and how that's influenced how we forecast, how we deal with the errors that we see sales going along, then all of a sudden, they drop off. And how do we adjust for that? And been some innovative ways to do it in time series forecasting as well as causal modeling. And nobody has the right handle on it. I think it's been very difficult, but it's global, and it's just tough.
Yeah. Now, that's very interesting, right? Because when we think of sales, the idea that people have of sales is they don't want to do forecasting. What they want to do is go out and sell. So my next question actually is to Jeff, which is actually, how did you get interested in this idea of looking at forecasting from a sales perspective?
Well, I'll attribute this to my colleagues because, as Holt said, he's not in sales, but he's an expert in methodology and forecasting. So seeing him regularly, as well as Dr. Dingus, we would throw around this idea, hey, we got to do a paper. We got to look into this. There was something there, but and I was intrigued. I was honored to work with these two, that they would allow me to come in and do a little bit of carrying some stuff. So the interest in that forecasting is, it drives everything, right? So that model, so how do we have, as Holt alluded to, how do we have a metric to predict for the future? So And how do we know that metric is accurate? So looking at the accuracy. So because our salespeople truly taking the time they need, they have the tools to do that. So it was just that interest involved to work on a relevant topic and with some esteemed colleagues was really attractive.
Fantastic. Now, Rebecca, I want to ask you this question, and I think you're muted, so maybe so Rebecca, the question I have for you actually is this, right? So most of the time when you take a look at forecasting, salespeople sometimes might not realize the importance of forecasting because they're out there. It's the daily grind trying to go hit the numbers and everything else. So when you started looking at this idea together with your colleagues, what were the thoughts going on in your mind? So did you want to talk to salespeople? Did you want to talk to sales managers? How did this kind of the idea evolve as you started to formulate this?
There are a couple of ways I can go into talking about this, because as we came up with the idea of this, we had just been here at our university, we had just been through a curricular revision of our sales program and done some updates there and been discussing, where does this sales and market forecasting course that Holt has designed and that he teaches, where does that fit in here? How do we encourage more of this a prevalence of that and the quantitative focus in these courses, to keep up with where modern day sales is going, right? But also from a perspective of these new sales, these students who are graduating as new salespeople, how do they better understand how that quota is formed? You mentioned they're out there in the daily, in the grind, but how are those numbers they're chasing made, right? And it all leads back to forecasting. So we're looking at how we can help them see it from a different view. Does that make sense? But then bridging that in, we wanted to see how they can, for us, it really, the origination of it was driven also from conversations about our students, getting them to better understand the tools within the CRM systems, to understand how to just view the importance of the data, and that, relationships are important, absolutely, but that is not going to be what keeps the longevity of your career successful.
Indeed. But I think it's very interesting because what started out again as looking at your curriculum and seeing where curriculum fits in led you to this really interesting piece of work where you ended up talking to a bunch of people in the business. So help me understand. So when you started, how did this kind of proceed? So you started by taking a look at how can we maybe try to position the class better, but suddenly it became bigger. So what was the kind of the next steps that you said, okay, we're going to try and take a look? And this could be for anybody. It could be Holt, it could be Rebecca, it could be Jeff. So who wants to take this here?
I'll take a stab at it, but then
Sure.
So why do it start? So kind of convergent, like with anything, ideas start coming together. Some conferences came up and then one thing came to another. Holt and Rebecca said, hey, let's get a panel assembled. Then we had to figure out how to get that. So then we had to go to our chair and get some funds. How do we do that? And then I think there was a marketing conference coming up and help me with I don't know the exact conference, but we said, hey, good place to go pilot this and see present our idea, kind of test the waters. And we did that. And then we started, we circulated the survey and started getting results. And then I guess it started from there. So it kind of started small and it kept getting bigger and bigger until we figured out what it is we're going to measure or handle.
And now, sorry, Holt, you want to say something?
I'll build on Jeff's comments and kind of loop back to your earlier question too about salespeople versus sales managers. We wanted to get a pretty comprehensive view at this. And so we have some data that's yet to be published where Jeff mentioned we had taken it to a conference. We've also asked similar questions to what's in this Business Horizon paper with academics who teach sales and marketing courses to get their perceptions of these pieces, to kind of see how that aligns as we're training up our new next generation of salespeople. But specific to this paper, if we don't know if there is, of course, those results are interesting, but whether or not there is a disconnect between the salespeople and the sales managers, I think it's hard to really make a case for how important it is for our salespeople to understand at least the basics of forecasting and the importance of it, the role of it across the industry or across their whole business, let alone industry. And so that's a piece where Holt's expertise really helps us break down that data and to make parallels.
Indeed.
It's amazing to me how often in business forecasting is done kind of by the seat of the pants.
Yeah.
We'll say next year will be 12% better, 8% better.
Yeah.
They'll go up by 5% without any real analytics. And you had alluded earlier to, the role of analytics. And it's important that we recognize that there's a good history of quantitative forecasting outperforming qualitative judgments. And some professionals have been slow to adapt to the use of quantitative methods. And it's not that the quantitative methods are the final answer. We use judgments all the time, judgments into the front end of it. What kind of data do we use? And judgments at the outcome end when we think, well, we need to adjust this forecast because we know that we're rolling out a new marketing campaign, or we know the government's going to cut some benefits or increase some benefits. So we take the quant and we add those judgments at both ends.
That's absolutely right, because I think we had a paper a couple of years ago where we looked at sales and operations alignment, but much more from the viewpoint of how do the salespeople make forecasting and how is it actually kind of received by the operations folks. And you would imagine that the qualitative part that you talk about here is much more from a sales perspective. And the operations people are going to be out there saying, okay, what did we do last year? What did we do the year before? And that's the quantitative part that you're talking about there. And essentially kind of what we wanted to say there was that operations people need to trust judgments more. And what we also said, salespeople had to embrace quantitative stuff more. So essentially what you are trying to say is actually trying to say, we just did interviews, but we actually have data that tries to say that something along those lines as well. So before we get into the results of what you found, I want to ask the most important point, because your paper was about forecasting, but there was another part that said women count. So why was that of interest to all of you? Why is it that, forecasting is important no matter what, but why did you have that part, women count? That really caught my attention. So
I'll just make it, we struggled with that title for what was the right words to put it in perspective. So.
And it's very tongue-in-cheek, right? You go with the Business Horizon style, tongue-in-cheek, but women count, men judge. What we're finding is that women and men both agree that quantitative forecasting is a better method, right? And across the board, that's generally been accepted anyway. But what we're finding here is that women were more likely to use the quantitative methods, while men were more likely than women were to make a judgment, right? A qualitative decision based purely on judgment. And, I laugh a little bit in our sales management textbooks, we call that executive opinion. But when we start to look at what that could be and what the implications can be on an organization, that can get very messy and a bit dangerous. And so, it was really startling when we saw such a strong difference in men and women there. And then if you take it a step further in that paper, we're finding also that women did not feel their forecasts were taken as seriously as what men felt their forecasts were.
Indeed.
Now, we did not compare, do women feel their forecasts are taken as seriously as men's, but respective to their own forecasts, women didn't feel they were taken as seriously as what the men felt. And that's, again, a very startling thing when we're looking at, the growing number of women coming into sales, as that continues to start to even out, but we're still not even there yet. That how do we make sure we, not to sneak into the back end of recommendations here, but we have to make sure we have support structures set up and organizational cultures where every employee can be met with success and that those results are going to count.
But it's absolutely fascinating what you're saying out there is the fact that, because I think the ramifications could be a lot more serious depending upon how volatile the markets are and how important and how razor thin your margins are. So that essentially, I think it's so incredible that you have this perception of what is important and how to actually make judgments. Actually, before we get into the actual results of it, let me ask this question as well. So when women felt that their kind of quantitative evaluation of what is going to be forecast and things like that, but was it met with kind of openness? And did you take a look at were their supervisors male or female? You know what I mean? So did women who actually did forecasting, and if their supervisors or directors were females, that it kind of worked better? Or you know what I mean? Because you also have that kind of interaction happening in the workplace as well. Did you look into that, or do you have conjectures for that as well?
Well, I think there's another paper right there.
Yeah. Because I think that would be very, very interesting, right? Because at the end of the day, if the assumption is that a lot of the so-called managers, or the people that the female salespeople or the women salespeople or women sales managers are reporting into, and if they happen to be male and they have a different attitude towards it, your forecast could be buried because it might not meet what the supervisor thinks is what they are going to be evaluated on. And there will be very interesting to see whether female or women, I should be careful when I say women or female, my apologies for that, but in terms of how that is perceived as well. So I think that's very interesting. So maybe you can unpack a little bit of some of the key findings that you had in this research. Holt, maybe you can go with this.
No, I think that Becca kind of summarized the sort of the most important findings in terms of women feeling less appreciated or less qualified, or that their forecasts were less likely to be acted on. Mm-hmm. And part of it goes back historically, that we have seen women as less quantitative and more qualitative across the board, whether it's in forecasting or other things. So it's really a lot of education needs to be done.
And in your research, do you find anything about were women more hesitant to come out with forecasts? Where they're much more circumspect, where they're much more, conservative in their forecast, whereas men would be a lot more, a combination of qualitative and quantitative, but then, tend to exaggerate the numbers a little bit more. Did you find anything like that, or were you not looking for those kind of findings in your research?
We didn't look at that explicitly, but I think one can kind of sense that. And if women feel that they're taken less seriously, then my guess is that they're going to be more hesitant to come forward and really argue their point forcefully and try to convince people that they're correct, because they feel that they're not taken as seriously. So, another issue that pervades all of this is something that you alluded to earlier in terms of goals. Yeah. So often, the manager has a goal in mind and really wants the forecast to match up with that goal. Indeed. Rather than the forecast driving the goal. We get it flipped around. And I had a very interesting conversation in Kuala Lumpur at a seminar with this poor guy who was literally almost in tears with me, because his manager told him what the forecast had to be. Yes. And maybe women are less likely to stand up to that.
Yeah, and for me, the whole idea that,
or maybe women are going to have a quantitative support for how they can stand up for it.
Well, that's very true. And another thing that kind of interplays with this, Becca, it was the age issue and the years of experience issue. And the males had more, they were older and had more years of experience. And that kind of dovetails with how you'll stand up for what you're doing.
Neat. I think that's essentially, it's very interesting, because at the end of the day, I'm just thinking of the ramifications of this. I didn't even kind of, your whole profit and loss for the company is going to be based on whether you are going to hype up the numbers, or you're going to stick to, the actual kind of what you're finding in the field as well. Because if you overestimate, you're going to have inventory pile up. It has an impact on your bottom line. If you underestimate, your customers are not going to be happy because you're not going to be able to meet your delivery times, and it has an impact on your reputation. So I think it's really, really interesting that even something as simple as gender could come in the way of an organization meeting its profitability targets, just because they cannot get over this kind of gender divide and understand that all of us are out there making equal contributions to the organization, which I think is very, very fascinating from that perspective. So let me ask Rebecca then. So essentially, what are some of the recommendations that you make for organizations and managers to factor in? Yeah.
I'm going to let Becca address that. I'm going to apologize. I have to run to a class.
Yeah.
So I'm going to leave.
Yeah. Nice meeting you. Yes. Rebecca, yeah.
Yeah. So some recommendations for organizations. We went around and around on that about this paper, because there are many ways that we could, really build some dreams of what we hope to see in the future. But at the heart of what is going to be supported most through the findings of this paper, our recommendations stem around a really strong organizational culture, an organizational culture that is focused on effective methods, is focused on rewarding good results that were built on effective methods, and giving the support, the training, the tools that are needed to get people there. A side finding that I think was kind of reduced a little bit in the in our revision process was about how women are less likely to receive training in a quantitative area, or something that in my opinion is more substantive. We see women get onto something that's more of an HR topic versus more of a work-oriented topic. And I'm talking about for women who are maybe in a sales type role, and the assignments are different, or they won't be in as many overnight or extended trainings, because many of the women are still taking care of things at home, right? And so we start to see that confound. And so organizations need to be really cognizant of that as they build a supportive environment with the accessible tools and training that is needed to help bridge this gap both ways. But at the same time, it's not just about training women, because what we're finding is that women are following the methods that are most effective. So we have to make sure men are also included in that, right? And that's being taken seriously. So it's kind of a conundrum of the support and consistency and respect of everyone's work, with making sure everyone has the same awareness of effective tools. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Jeff, my question is building up on what Rebecca was saying right now. So would you also say that part of organizational culture as well is, apart from encouraging everybody to follow a much more rigorous way of forecasting, would you also say that KPIs, key performance indicators of salespeople, increasingly have to focus on forecasting accuracies as a way of evaluating? Because most of the time in many B2B organizations that I've had a chance to work with, that sometimes gets forgotten, because if you're hitting your numbers, that is much more important than actually whether you are doing anything in terms of forecasting. So what are your thoughts on that one, Jeff?
That is a great thought, and it kind of follows along with what Rebecca was just saying. We found that both men and women, or sales managers, say, hey, we want our sales people we're hiring to have this background. But in the new sales people thought it was important, but there seemed to be a disconnect. The skills they need, they don't have, or like we talked early on, adding that course in our curriculum, we thought pretty important. That's the kind of the genesis for this paper. So I really believe, if you look at facts, and Holt would be a real one to help with, if your accuracy of your forecast improves a little bit, your performance of the whole organization improves. And I think that's something that maybe gets lost a little bit sometimes. That forecast is not just for the salespeople, it's for the manufacturing folks, it's for your customers, it's for the whole organization.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I wanted to kind of also ask is that, did you, for example, make out any differences from complex sales processes? So in the survey that you had, did you find out that there were some people in much more complex industries as against others, where it could very well be that when you're in a very complex industry where forecasting accuracy becomes even more important because of long lead times and everything else? Did you do anything? Did you kind of observe anything where in more complex sales situations, forecasting accuracy is much more important, but still it does not necessarily factor into how salespeople are evaluated? You know what I mean? Things like
That's
this.
something we have talked about. It is unfortunately not in this study in the way that we collected the data. Everything is business to business, but we don't have it broken down in a way to know the complexity of their sales process. But bringing that back to our previous question, you're exactly right. We need to be able to dig into that to better understand how that aligns, because we talked about how, salespeople are not as focused on forecasts because they're chasing the numbers, but we need to be able to align how those numbers that correlates to this forecast if we look at the impact across the whole organization. And I think that's a point that everybody knows, but maybe it doesn't get enough thought of what those ramifications are.
Absolutely. And I think I was also thinking, as you were saying, is that it'll be interesting to see if at some point in time, maybe not with this research, but maybe something that you can think about moving forward, would be to see whether the CEO of the company, if they have kind of a sales background or a kind of a much more of a finance or an operational background, where that would then have a trickle down impact on how forecasting is seen as being important. I'm not necessarily saying that anybody who's a CEO who's gone through sales does not think forecasting is important, but the rigor in which it is applied could be quite different. And I think, is that something that you also are looking into moving forward, or do you already have any kind of ideas about that as well?
That's an awesome idea. We have not done anything in that area, but I'm thinking about it because I was just reading a recent LinkedIn study that's talking about how modern day sales or modern day CEOs, their background is in sales. Their first or second job was as a BDR, an SDR, something of that nature. And which is very different from CEOs we saw a decade or two ago. Indeed. So I think that's a really interesting idea to explore.
And I think because I would imagine that that's the case as well, because you would easily imagine that, of course, a company that everybody talks about is like Apple, right? You have Steve Jobs and then you have Tim Cook. Tim came from operations, whereas Steve Jobs was much more, for lack of a better word, a visionary. I'm not saying that Tim Cook is not visionary, far from it, right? But essentially, each of them came and they brought something unique to the organization. But I'm sure that what they believed in has a big impact on how the rest of the organization also looks at how to pay importance to certain things in the way they evaluate, recruit people as well. So I think that's very, very interesting. So last kind of, what recommendations would you make for women who are going into sales, especially about forecasting? So I'll begin with Rebecca, and then maybe Jeff, you can close it out with what recommendations you would have for women in sales, especially regarding forecasting.
I think that this advice could go to anyone, but targeting women in particular, right? Don't be afraid of the numbers. Learn what the numbers are, learn how to dig in, learn what makes those numbers change, the numbers that form your quota, but also the bigger forecast and what are the impacts across your organization. Salespeople are in this boundary spanning role, and the better they can be familiar with that knowledge, I think that they will really excel and stand out to their managers, but also to being able to better represent their customers because they just have a better comprehensive understanding. So I think that's a big thing. I think, take the bull by the horns if you're one of the people who goes, I'm not great with numbers. I was a math major in undergrad. I was not, my degree's in math, not marketing. So I do come from that perspective, that I just believe everyone needs that strong analytical foundation to really, it will pay off in ways you just can't predict in the future. So dig into those numbers, understand the methodology, figure out, how to use, if you have a strong attention to detail, figure out how to use that to your advantage.
Indeed.
To get the different data systems to talk, to learn the forecasting methods within your own CRM system. You may or may not be targeted with forecasting responsibilities, but be familiar enough that you know how to read and understand.
Absolutely. Great. Jeff?
Well, I would kind of leverage with that. It goes whether you're a man or a woman. So these techniques, I think being confident, and I'll just take a little bit from one of my classes. We have a sales management class that they do more forecasting from sales managers. And I take them through a little bit. Hey, you're the salesperson. You got to know what these numbers are.
Indeed.
And you got to be confident in these numbers. How do you get these numbers? Do you just, as Holt mentioned, hey, add 10% to this and move forward? So again, getting comfortable with working with numbers.
Yeah.
I've got a class, we just went through some ratio analysis in a section of one of our modules. And I know when I tell students, always the word is, I know what you're going to say about this. Numbers suck. They don't like it. And I said, so you think you're in sales, you don't have to deal with numbers. I said, far from it. You have to understand them.
Indeed.
You have to be comfortable with what that number means, what it can mean. And again, the more you can, I think mentoring, I'm getting off track here, so I apologize.
No.
But again, finding someone in your academic career, mentor with them, male or female, and then kind of work with that, because we know a lot of people know people, and that's the nature of a human as well as a sales profession. So.
No, I think it's really cool that we talk about this, because I think if I were to take a look at your studies, I would actually imagine that as a salesperson, I should be able to even understand the forecast of my customer. Honestly, that's my takeaway from this as well. In fact, I think that if you, and again, as you correctly pointed out, both Rebecca as well as Jeff, is that it's not female or male, but the idea is that because your study was looking at women, but I think that's very interesting. But no matter what, if you have it within your own organization, chances are that you can also understand your customers' way of doing business. So if nothing else, even if you don't do forecasting for your own organization, understanding the forecasting numbers of your customers is going to help you be successful in selling your own value. And I think that is also something that I took away when I was listening to you, when I was glancing through your article and reading through your article. And for me, another takeaway is most definitely, if I'm a sales manager, is encourage my people to actually come up with a forecasting with numbers and based on quantitative data, and justify with your qualitative gut feeling that only you have as a salesperson, because you're out there in the trenches with your customers. I think that is invaluable that you need to do. But as a sales manager, I should be pushing for that a lot more. And another takeaway that I had, and again, you can correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm a manager, is that if you are a woman manager, do not be afraid to ask your male subordinates for quantitative reasons as to why they come up with a forecast, and not just come up with qualitative, because at the end of the day is you either as a woman sales rep, you need to be looking at forecasting, or as a woman sales manager, you should be enforcing quantitative forecasting. I think is very, very important. Of course, it's true for men as well. But I think that is my takeaway from this really, really interesting article, which I think began with forecasting, which is important. But again, talking about how you would imagine that forecasting is equally important across everybody in the organization, but it looks like women are perceived differently than men, which I think should not be the case.
And I might add just one more recommendation snippet, especially for those new to the career. Find your mentors, find a champion within your organization. Jeff spoke to finding a mentor, maybe one of your past professors. That's great on many levels, but also start to find your network of champions within your organization so that your work is taken seriously. And when you feel it's not, you have those people to go to say, okay, why was this not taken seriously? Did I do something wrong? Do I have a past track record that's not dependable? Or is this a poor culture that
Yeah.
nobody's picked up on?
Indeed.
Right. And
Indeed.
they can help you grow a voice and grow confidence, because if we have people who don't feel taken seriously, morale is low. They're going to be, very ready to swap and leave the company. No organization wants a mass exit of their women, right?
Yeah.
Let alone any employee. And this was all, I'll mention again, this was pre-pandemic data.
Yeah.
So when we look at the turnover rates we're seeing now and how many people are willing to leave their job, even without a new career in hand, this is something that really needs to be viewed. So we need to, and we need to be each other's champions. It's not just find your own champions, but make sure you are a champion for others. You're looking out for those who may not have as much of a voice or the confidence to have grown their voice yet. That's going to be a leadership element.
Indeed. Well,
so I'm excited about what I see in our classrooms and what Sales Education Foundation is promoting, and all the various resources for especially women to plug in there. And our women in our program are just killing it. I tell the men, hey guys, you got to step up your game. So I'm excited about what that forebodes for the coming profession.
Yeah,
there's some sharp people coming out of here.
Absolutely. And I think it's great that you have universities like yours actually working hard to not just promote in the classroom, but actually also parlay this into work and research like yours that other managers can also benefit from as well. So thank you so much for your time, Rebecca, Jeff, and Holt, who had to leave. And for the audience, again, stay tuned for more episodes like these, where we'll talk to academics, we'll talk to practitioners, and to get their take on current sales practices. Thank you once again.
Thank you.